When someone mentions the words TWA Flight 800, what comes to your mind? If you know a fair bit about aviation, you would almost definitely picture a Boeing 747 falling from the sky after a breakup mid-air. And that goes for most people. After all, it is a famous crash and is a hot topic even in today's world, all those years later. But if you ask someone about TWA Flight 800, you could be caught off guard when they mention a Boeing 707 taking off from Rome that caught on fire and overran the runway. And, unlike the 747 crash that happened in the 90s, this crash would date back to the mid-60s, where the jet age had only just begun. I mean, after all, when you search up Flight 800 on Google, you can scroll through the whole first page and not see anything about a Boeing 707 that crashed in Italy, with the only reference being listed under the main 1996 747 crash Wikipedia page, meaning that this 1964 version is often overlooked by the average internet surfer. So, without further ado, this is the untold story of the original Flight 800. The 1960s was a golden age of aviation. Flying was a luxury and TWA was at the forefront, offering unmatched service and cutting-edge aircraft. The Boeing 707, known as the aircraft that kicked off the jet age, was one of, if not the highest-selling commercial aircraft in that decade. The date is November 23rd, 1964. It was an unusually cold day for the standards of Rome, with temperatures seeing lows of -7 degrees Celsius. Despite the cold, the skies were clear. The perfect day for flying an aircraft like the 707. The crew on the aircraft N769TW were preparing for takeoff from Leonardo da Vinci Fiumicino Airport. TWA received the plane back in 1960 and it had been flying comfortably for almost 4 years. And on this day, the aircraft was nearing the end of a long flight from the former Charles B. Wheeler downtown airport all the way to Cairo International Airport in Egypt. To complete this flight, the aircraft would need to make a whopping 6 stopovers, with this flight out of Rome being the 5th. They were to fly to the 6th and final stopover, Ellinikon Airport in Greece. The plane was carrying 62 passengers and 11 crew, a relatively low amount for the 707-300. The cockpit crew for this fatal flight consisted of Vernon Lovell, who had 2,617 flight hours in the 707, First Officer William Slaughter, Second Officer John Churchill, and Flight Engineer H.W. Larry. After a visual inspection by Captain Lovell, the crew decided the First Officer William Slaughter would fly them out of Rome. With his 1,920 flight hours on the 707, he was very experienced in his field. After a pre-flight checklist during their taxi, the ATC would give them immediate takeoff clearance, meaning they wouldn't even have to hold short of the runway. This is often referred to as a rolling takeoff. The passengers in the cabin were relaxed, with US nationals nearing the end of their journey to Greek and Egyptian nationals heading to their home country. As Captain Lovell began the takeoff roll, he was preparing to hand over control to First Officer Slaughter once the plane reached 80 knots. As the plane accelerated and neared V1 speed, engine number 4 indicated a problem. The engine was showing little to no thrust output. Before they could digest the situation, the reverse thruster light for engine number 2 lit up as well. The crew now knew that something was wrong with their plane. In a split-second decision, Captain Lovell began the rejected takeoff procedures. Full reverse thrust and brakes were applied. As the aircraft began to slow down, it was not deaccelerating as fast as it should have, and was shifting significantly to the right. And on top of that, a crew member alerted Vernon that the landing gear on the right side of the plane had blown. They now knew that something was catastrophically wrong. And even worse, the last 2,000 feet of the runway on this day had been closed for maintenance. The end of the runway was approaching fast, and as they were speeding down the runway, Vernon spotted a steamroller traversing the runway. He tried everything to turn it to the left, but it was no use, as engine number 4 crashed into the steamroller, knocking it over and starting a fire on the right wing. Eventually, the plane would come to a halt with less than 1,000 feet of runway left. Vernon would cut off all power to the engines, but tragically, doing this caused a rapid explosion in the fuselage, causing smoke and fire to fill the cabin and block exits. Evacuation efforts swiftly began as all crew rushed to the cabin to help anybody they could. Vernon saw the cabin crew having trouble with the emergency doors, and panicked passengers would fill the cabin in disarray. So in an instant, Vernon went to the cockpit and escaped through the window using the emergency rope. Once on the ground, his plan was to help passengers get out from the outside. But in a shocking and disturbing discovery, he saw the entire middle of the plane ablaze, with fuel leaking, causing an inferno in and around the aircraft. Captain Lovell would do all he could, pinning passengers to the ground and extinguishing their clothes, and dragging people to safety. Fire crew responded within minutes, and it was thanks to Vernon and the firefighters that 23 people were able to survive this harrowing incident. But unfortunately, out of the 73 people on board, 50 people would die from this crash, with 20 people suffering injuries, including Captain Lovell. One of the injured would die later in hospital. Vernon claims the night after this crash was the worst of his life. He couldn't sleep, with the overbearing thoughts of the people who perished, and by morning claimed that he did the best he could, despite the circumstances. And I think we can all agree when we say that Captain Vernon W. Lovell was a true hero, and that he saved many lives. 15 months after the crash, the Italian authorities had their final report. There was a malfunction in the engine 2 reverse thrusters. A hydraulic duct was disconnected, causing the reverse thrust light to falsely illuminate, even though the clamshells were not deployed. And upon Captain William deploying all 4 reverse thrusters, engine number 2 was still not producing forward thrust. This is what caused the sluggish stopping power and the veering to the right. This is known as thrust asymmetry. The main runway at Fiumicino Airport that was undergoing maintenance was supposedly fit for a 707 to take off. However, they failed to factor in what would happen if a plane had a problem in its stopping power, like the problem that Flight 800 faced. Along with this, the crew would insist to store more fuel in the wings, avoiding using the fuselage tanks. The reason for this is not fully known. Therefore, despite the crew following the correct procedures for a rejected takeoff, the steamroller that collided with the right wing caused the fuel tank to leak, which would be ignited by a spark, causing the subsequent explosion and fire. This accident called for big changes in the aviation industry. The need for better emergency cabin lighting was raised, as passengers simply got lost among the sheer amount of smoke in the cabin. Emergency doors and slides would also be optimised for a quicker and more efficient exit in the case of events like Flight 800. A new way to see the exact position of the thrust reversers was also suggested. Overall, this crash would be a harsh lesson to companies and travellers of the 60s. It highlighted how aviation had a long way to go in terms of safety, a message that we still see today, especially with the Boeing company. After this incident, Vernon would become more and more passionate in advocating changes in aviation safety, and later released a book titled Airline Safety is a Myth, in which he detailed his POV in the accident, the aftermath, and suggestions for a brighter and safer future in aviation. Many of his ideas were actually implemented by Boeing and other companies. So, there we have it. Vernon Lovell would go down in history as the legend and hero of TWA Flight 800, or at least that's how it was supposed to go. Because as you all know, in July 1996 a TWA Boeing 747 would break apart mid-air after an explosion, crashing into the Atlantic Ocean and killing all 230 people on board. The event was and still is shrouded in conspiracy, and the root cause of the explosion is still unknown, and most likely we will never see any solid answers to this incredible case. And all of that is why, if you were to search up TWA Flight 800 in YouTube today, you would most likely see nothing to do with the 707 and nothing to do with Captain Vernon W. Lovell. And therefore, the story of the original TWA Flight 800 may forever remain forgotten and overshadowed, locked away in the history books. You've been watching Jetlagged. See you all next time.